Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. Ukraine is facing one of its most significant wartime political challenges as President Volodymyr Zelenskyy attempts to manage the fallout from the removal of Defense Minister Mykhailo Fedorov while maintaining confidence among the public, military, and international partners. The biggest development today is that the war is increasingly becoming a test of political resilience, not just military endurance. Ukraine is still trying to manage internal turbulence over its defense leadership. But at the same time, Kyiv is beginning to see signs that international confidence in its long-term survival is strengthening. The clearest example came from the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Gdansk, Poland, where the conversation shifted noticeably. Instead of focusing almost entirely on emergency assistance and rebuilding after destruction, companies and governments were discussing investment opportunities. That is a meaningful psychological change. Ukraine is still at war. Russian missiles are still hitting cities, but some investors are beginning to operate under the assumption that Ukraine will remain independent and eventually become part of the European economic system. The conference produced around 160 agreements worth roughly $11 billion in private investment and assistance. The U.S. Export-Import Bank announced up to $300 million in financing for Naftogaz, Ukraine's state energy company, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development committed additional funding. Former Google CEO Eric Schmidt and his wife have also invested in Ukrainian commercial real estate and drone companies, showing that some major investors are already positioning themselves for a post-war economy. That optimism comes with a major political challenge for President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The fallout from his decision to remove Defense Minister Mykhailo Fedorov continues. Thousands of protesters have remained in the streets demanding that Fedorov return and calling for changes in Ukraine's military leadership. What started as anger over one personnel decision has expanded into a broader debate over how Ukraine should fight the war going forward. The question is not simply whether Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky stays or goes. The bigger issue is the future direction of Ukraine's defense establishment. Fedorov represented a younger, technology-focused approach centered around innovation and rapid adaptation. Syrsky represents a more traditional military command structure shaped by decades of conventional warfare. Zelenskyy has met with several possible replacements, including senior commanders such as Mikhailo Drapati and Ole Apostol. His chief of staff, Kirilo Budanov, has said the government understands public concerns and is working through the issue. The challenge is balancing accountability and reform without creating instability at the top of a military fighting a major war. Russia, meanwhile, continues trying to pressure Ukraine through a combination of strikes, economic disruption, and information warfare. One area where Moscow appears increasingly willing to take risks is the Black Sea. The conflict there is no longer only about naval power. It is about trade, energy, and the ability of Ukraine to remain connected to global markets. A Russian missile strike against the cargo vessel Golden Leo killed 10 crew members, including Indian and Syrian sailors. The ship was carrying Ukrainian grain, and the attack prompted India to summon a Russian diplomat and issue a strong condemnation. That is notable because India has maintained a close relationship with Moscow for decades. Another ship, the Liberian-flagged LPG tanker Gas Lisbon, was struck near Romania's coastline while carrying propane toward Ukraine. Romanian officials said the incident was likely connected to Russia's war effort. The significance is that commercial shipping routes are now becoming another arena where this conflict creates international consequences beyond Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine has responded by continuing a campaign designed to raise the cost of the war for Moscow. The focus of these operations is less about individual targets and more about forcing Russia to defend a much larger area. Ukrainian strikes have hit Russian energy facilities, logistics centers, air defense systems, and military infrastructure far from the front lines. The goal is to stretch Russian resources and make the Kremlin spend more money and manpower protecting assets deep inside its own territory. One example is Crimea, where Ukraine has continued targeting infrastructure connected to Russian control of the peninsula. Ukrainian officials say these strikes have forced Russia to reposition air defense and drone capabilities away from frontline areas to protect rear locations. The broader impact is that Russia increasingly has to make difficult choices about where to allocate limited resources. Protect the front line, protect Crimea, protect energy facilities, protect shipping routes. Ukraine's strategy is built around creating too many problems for Moscow to solve at once. Russia is still capable of inflicting serious damage, however. The United Nations reported that June had the highest civilian casualty figures in Ukraine since April 2022, with at least 293 civilians killed and nearly 2,000 injured. Russian missile and drone attacks continue targeting population centers, energy infrastructure, and industrial facilities. At the same time, Russia appears to be paying a growing domestic price for the war. A state polling organization reported Vladimir Putin's approval rating at 65.1%, lower than previous wartime levels. Again, that number would be considered strong in many countries, but inside Russia's political system, it represents a noticeable decline. The reasons are increasingly tangible for ordinary Russians. Inflation remains elevated, taxes have increased, Ukrainian strikes have begun affecting fuel infrastructure. And the Kremlin's attempt to tighten control over the digital environment has created frustration. The state-backed Max messaging platform was intended to replace foreign apps and bring more communications under government oversight. But technical problems after App Store removals disrupted that effort. The Kremlin is also continuing a familiar pattern of reinforcing security narratives at home. The FSB announced the killing of a man in Tyumen, accused of preparing sabotage against an industrial facility. Independent Russian outlet iStories said this was the 87th case since the start of the full-scale invasion, where the FSB reported killing a suspect during detention operations. Moscow is also mixing confrontation with selective engagement abroad. FBI Director Kash Patel is reportedly planning a visit to Moscow and St. Petersburg later this year, which would be the first trip by a sitting FBI director to Russia since 2013. At the same time, Russia expelled 2 Italian diplomats following Italy's removal of Russian military attachés accused of espionage. The big picture is that both sides are increasingly fighting a broader contest over endurance. Ukraine is trying to prove it can survive militarily, politically, and economically long enough to outlast Russia's ambitions. Russia is trying to demonstrate that it can absorb pressure, maintain domestic control, and continue imposing costs on Ukraine and its supporters. You've reached the end of today's intelligence download. If you enjoyed it, a review or comment helps the show find the right people. For more Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and DPRK coverage, visit restrictedhandling.substack.com. Until next time.